And we will now speak with Dr. Orzala Nemat, an internationally known Afghan scholar, think tank leader, and activist. She's an expert in political ethnography, holding a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in London. And she's currently, as she told me, stranded in California. And so, yeah, let us talk to Orzala now.
Thank you, Christoph. Assalamu alaikum. Good day, good morning, good evening to everyone who is listening. I hope you have my voice. I can see that you have my camera. Okay, perfect. It's a great pleasure and honor to be part of this panel. I would like to start with thanking both organizations, Al-Sharq and Disorient, for such an excellent panel in terms of timing and in terms of the importance of such discussions, particularly in the time that potentially some of us, probably not me, I have to confess, but some of us may have a little bit of more time to spend on virtual world, avoiding travels due to COVID-19. So it's great that we are having this conversation. And in terms of my talking points, what I would like to highlight here is to start with actual title of the panel by organizers in terms of Islamic feminism in Afghanistan and the US-Taliban talks. So with regards to Islamic feminism, I have to say, following colleagues' full presentation on the Afghan history, is that when it comes to feminism and whether women's movement in Afghanistan identify themselves as feminists or Muslim feminists or not is a very interesting subject to talk about. Just before I go to this question, I would like to highlight, because audience did not have the opportunity due to bad internet connection to hear our wonderful colleague Jamila Jan Afghani's presentation. So very briefly, for contextual understanding, the struggle for women's rights and women's movements in Afghanistan goes back to 100 years. Afghanistan and Afghan women have been at forefront of reforms, democratization processes throughout the history of Afghanistan, the contemporary history of Afghanistan. We have a phase in the prehistory in very much older days and years where we had strong women scholars, we had women poets, we had women quite active in the social fields. Rabia Balkhi is an example, Mahjoubeh Hirawi is an example. And then historically speaking, if you go further down, earlier, there were women who were not probably on the complete lead, but as wives and as daughters of different leaders have played, or mothers in cases of different leaders, have played critical role in the Afghan history, and their names are mentioned. We have Nazo Ana, Zarghuna Ana, we have Malalai of Maiwand, who was very actively, for example, fighting in the Afghan Anglo wars, because the history of Afghanistan is full of wars and in contests. So within the context of war and violence, women also at least raise their voice for independence of Afghanistan and their voice for justice. So there is that historical perspective that often our audience internationally are not much aware of. When it comes to the most recent context as well, throughout the 40 years of war, women have played a very important role, a non-violent role, I would say, in the history of the 40 years of war and violence. During the periods, I will not go back to the history as our colleague earlier presented, but just very briefly, throughout the years, whether as political activists, as non-violent political activists during the Soviet invasion, women were put in prison because they were demonstrating, protesting the invasion of the Soviets on Afghanistan. Following to that, during the civil war and regional wars that Afghanistan was dragged into, despite the fact that women became the prime victim of horrible, violations and violences, they have been quite active in delivery of humanitarian services. In the women and the NGOs played an important role. Women in different humanitarian organizations were quite active in social fields, not much in the political field, I have to say. But then the Taliban took over in '96, and throughout that period, a woman became really sort of completely ignored, not only in the political field, but also social fields. Lots of restrictions were put in place by the Taliban forces at the time to ban the schools. I'm sure everyone is aware of these stories from the Taliban time, where women could only be doctors, and that also under context that they should have been accompanied by a male relative to go there. So that's a sort of to remind everyone that the history of Afghan women's struggle is not limited to the post-2001 context. So one thing that's, if you look at the nature of, women being active, as I mentioned, in different periods and phases of history, women have been quite active in different contexts. But when it comes to using different identities, it's interesting discussion and maybe requires further sort of thinking about, is that we are quite sensitive in terms of our history of isms in Afghanistan, whether it is Islamism or communism or socialism and so forth. And in that way, in the post-2001 context, I would say it's very few among Afghan activists and leaders who will call themselves a feminist or who will call themselves a Muslim feminist. So we have to also remember that not every Afghan woman who is active is a Muslim feminist. We are a Muslim majority country, that's without any doubt. But then we preferred, I can say this in a general way, but of course there are particular cases. We can say that in general, women have preferred to stay away from feminist word, but then in practice be active more, to be more inclusive of bringing secular and non-secular Muslims around the same table and actually focus on women's rights issues, as opposed to the isms that give us a specific or a particular identity. Now, that's more about the sort of the women in Afghanistan, their active role throughout the years. Even during the Taliban time, I have to say that women have been quite active in the social fields. They have find their ways of resistance and resilience through organizing different educational activities in their houses. I myself was involved in organizing literacy classes for women in different neighborhoods in Afghanistan in an underground way, because of course the Taliban were not aware. Have they been aware of our activities? It could have serious consequences for myself, for my family, for people and colleagues who were involved with me in these activities. So that's one side of the story. The other side that I can see, there was also a request from me to talk about, the Taliban and what the sort of so-called change of Taliban mean in the current context. And in that regard, I mean, the history of Taliban and how they were established is known to most people. Taliban became an active movement in the 94-96 period, and this was a time that majority of those mujahideen who were fighting against the Soviet invasion started to be engaged in the power grabbing infighting in the country, in looting the country from north to south, east to west, central, and everywhere. And this became like a story, the narrative that, oh, we are the students of madrasas and we just are here to bring stability and all that. Unfortunately, in that period as well, there are little evidence that shows that this was a real, genuine local movement, because a movement that is grassroots cannot come with very sophisticated weapons and sophisticated cars, 4x4s, all new models and all that, for people who are well aware of, the prices and everything back then and even now. So that can also tell you that the Taliban were not a genuine and local movement coming out of the Afghanistan's reality. There was a sort of a merge of bringing some people. Of course, the ground forces were the Taliban, but the thinking behind the movement from the very early days was directly taking us and was directly rooted to the Cold War. It was rooted to the regional competition of different regional countries in Afghanistan, using the land as a kind of a center for conflicts and competitions of different regional powers. Because between a period of 1990 or 1989, when the Soviets left, and all the way to 2001, there was this period that Afghanistan was sort of left by themselves, and then the US and the rest of the Western allies who supported Mujahideen in the earlier days would just sort of abandon Afghanistan. So in that context, what I can say is that at least in the period that they were ruling, there was much less violence, because there wasn't any energy or force left to resist them at that time, with an exception of few pockets of resistance in some parts. But then it was only after 9/11 that the Taliban, were the center of attention by international forces, and as a result, the 9/11 happened, and the military intervention resulted in collapse of the regime. Now, whether in the post-2001 context, and as we speak now, it's like almost nearly 20 years, the Taliban have changed as a movement or not, my answer to that is that unfortunately, yes, they have changed, and the change is not a positive one, because the Taliban movement in the past was identified only as a force that brings some level of security, but sacrifice entirely half of the population for that security that they brought in, as security of like a physical, that you would feel safe when you go out. But that was with a very high price of ignoring completely half of the population of the country, being women. Now, in the post-2001 context, gradually after they have sort of reimagined their insurgency activities, they become one of the most radically aggressive and most radically violent groups that are known around the world. I am hardly hearing any other forces, even including the similar to Taliban sort of forces, that they will target like newborn children. They have that in Afghanistan. I hardly hear of, anti-state groups and organizations committing such sort of, suicide attacks that can have massive civilian casualties. Not only the military and the government forces, but the civilians are the prime target. Every year we have a report that is verified through different sources by UNAMA, and this report is highlighting civilian casualties and how they are increasing to its worst. So in the current context, as we speak, one of the key indicators to define the Taliban is a massive level of violence and fear that they are identified with. And that comes from a reality of this only one resort that they can use to maintain power, because it seems that in the current context of 2020, the Taliban are no longer the peace bringers. They're actually a very violent force that are using all kind of unacceptable rules and principles in order to bring in order to gain back the power that they think they were deprived of back in 2001. And so that's more about the changes. And of course, they will make excuses that, oh, the recent incidents are not us, it is Daesh. But for those of you unfamiliar, in the context of Afghanistan, there is not a very clear line of separation between who the Taliban are and who the Daesh are. They are both, two sides of the same coin. When it comes to their regional and their global supports, I think there is little difference between them. When it comes to their actions and activities in the country, very different, very difficult to make a distinction of which attack, which suicide attack, which attack that caused massive, civilian casualties, and the most horrifying part, is done by whom among the two groups, ISK or the Taliban. Now, why the Taliban becomes so violent is also important. They're identifying themselves as the forces that are fighting this so-called occupation. Was this an occupation is a question to be answered, and whether this war that they are fighting could be justified within the context of Islam and the principles of Islam is also another larger question. And that does Islam allow such kind of activity? So these are much bigger questions, and Muslim scholars across the world are having these debates and discussions. And basically, time and again, we have heard, we hope to hear more from the Muslim scholars globally about, giving us a clear idea, because the confusion with the Taliban type movements are that they try to use religion as their weapon to mobilize a Muslim majority country's people, because in Afghanistan, due to lots of limitations and poverty, there is not enough possibility for the younger generation to have full access and knowledge of how things are globally and within their context. And that's why it's very easy to mobilize them. The other thing that really turned Taliban's ground forces such violent to an extent that they are ready to take their own life and do these actions is also the actions and practices of our other side in the conflict, the government's forces and their international allies. Unfortunately, night raids, bombings, targeting civilians by the aerial bombardments or by the different attacks by Afghan security forces and their international supporters did not help in trying to sort of bring Taliban more to a moderate mood. It actually triggered this whole story of radicalization in the country. It triggered it in a form that if my house is attacked and I lose everyone in my family because of an attack, even if I'm not a Taliban, I might have a thinking of, oh, is this the only way that I can take a revenge? The notion of revenge is quite strong in the countries like Afghanistan with the realities that it faces. So that also is a very important factor to note when talking about Afghanistan, because it's not simply it's not a simple action that one day some people wake up and they are more violent than before. But this violence is systematically done through dehumanization of this movement, and also through actions and practices and massive level of corruption and unprofessional actions by different government forces throughout the years since 2006 up until now, or since 2001 up until now. And that's where we are. So within this context, we have the US-Taliban deal. I will briefly talk about that and then close my remarks in that part. With regards to the US-Taliban deal now, some of the internationals, whether scholars or international policy people engaged with the policies, are trying to portray that the Afghan conflict as a conflict that has very local natures. It's a fight between a very Islamic, movement in some sort of a secular or some sort of a more non-Islamic movement as opposed to the Islamic. So they try to portray that the Taliban are more traditional, they are more Muslim than you who are inside the government or outside the government who don't accept the Taliban, and therefore let us reconcile the two together. They overlook the realities, the history of how these different forces and groups come to around to exist, and how they could actually reconcile, whether there is a possibility of reconciliation. The fight is framed in different ways. One of this is, Republic, supportive of Islamic Republic of Afghanistan on one side, the government, some of the opposition are also involved in this rhetoric of, defending the state and defending Islamic Republic in the country. The other side is the Taliban, who are the only force that are pushing still for their Islamic Emirate, the form of, or the political order, or the Nizam, as we call it in Farsi, in Dari, and Pashto. So the Nizam is really an apparent sort of topic of discussion on who should be the ruler and how that rule will take shape. But then others are also like people who are more pragmatically looking at the issue of, you know, resolving this conflict. They are looking at, you know, let's just have a more sort of an intra-Afghan dialogue and try to resolve it by through these dialogues, because it's more about power sharing. So everyone should have power. The Taliban were left out of the power in 2001, and that's why they were fighting. No, actually, it was not the only reason for the Taliban fighting. The Taliban started, re-emerged the insurgency because the sources that were funding them felt so, and they, after a retreat of a few years, they come back to the scene because they still didn't get what they were looking for. And I'm speaking here mainly about our regional, our largest neighbor in the eastern and southern Afghanistan. They didn't get what they were looking for, and so that was an easy way to do it. But it was also triggered, I mean, the local mobilization was triggered by, as I said, the actions and practices against the Taliban, that they were not reconciled, that they were not reintegrated in the society, and it was natural for them to get back to the movement. And so finally, this deal that is signed between the US and the Taliban, very quickly what I can say about it is that, number one, this deal does not have any other side but the Taliban and the US signing with each other. The government of Afghanistan, let alone the women or the people or the civil society from Afghanistan, the entire country was exempted from it, and it was a sign, more a deal rather than a peace deal. There is no peace in it, and I'm glad that nobody is using this as a US-Taliban peace deal, because it's nothing to do with peace. It's just a deal that is more framed as an exit from Afghanistan. And whether it will have a result or not, unfortunately, so far, we didn't see any concrete results in a positive way. What we have seen is that pre-deal for a week, there was a week of complete, you know, reduction in violence. I cannot say complete end of the violence, but we had a week of a very peaceful time across the country. No attacks, nothing. That was the week just before this the deal was signed with the Taliban. No Daesh was attacking the country, no Taliban were attacking the country. Suddenly, after the deal signed, then again the attacks are escalating in a level that yesterday we had a statement that this April there are 25% higher violence in casualties than last April this time, last year this time, April 2019. So it's drastic, and the scale of the attacks are also quite terrifying, because there are attacks on you know, hospitals, maternity hospitals, funerals, and there are continuous attacks on rural population, something that also challenges the notion that, oh, at one point the Taliban came, or the Taliban supporters came and say, you know, they are the defenders of the Afghan rural areas as opposed to you city people. And now they are targeting the rural areas, yes, for their attacks against the Afghan forces or against the Afghan people in general. So this is a very worrying period for us, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. It's becoming very challenging as we are facing tremendous challenges in terms of, you know, lack of medical facilities across the country, and in terms of, you know, a deep level of poverty that avoids people in general to respect social distancing, to respect, you know, the so-called global call for staying home. Majority of the people in Afghanistan cannot afford staying home and not just go out and work to earn money and bring food there for their families. So poverty level is very high. Security is deteriorating. Unfortunately, as we speak, there are constant attacks, one after the other, in different provinces and different cities or in rural areas, and people are still suffering. And who can really help this is also a question. I think we are reaching to a point that it seems like the governments, the states across the world are completely sort of failing in bringing a safety. So this is a perfect platform to bring sort of a conversation of people to people, how you all and how we all can get together and get the support of, local, grassroots civil societies, individuals who can, basically at least portray that attacking hospitals, attacking, mosques, people who were breaking their fasts were attacked yesterday in 2 different provinces, unfortunately. So these are nothing to do with, not only that they are nothing to do with Islam, but they are actually doing something to Islam, that they are providing a very negative image of Islam across the world. And our duty and our responsibility as Muslims is to really denounce them and not provide any space for such actions, and say, if you really want to be a peaceful movement, that's fine. But if you use violence, which is the main source of their identity as we speak, this is not going to really work and bring any peace and prosperity to the country. So I'll end my remarks here, and we'll be happy to answer some questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Orzala, for all these informations, and also, yeah, for kind of starting from the point where Jamila tried to begin. And I suggest that we start with a couple of, or 4 questions, in fact, about the issue of women and feminism. So Maya asks, I learned that feminism in the Iranian context is rejected because it is a Western concept. Afghanistan has, of course, a different history with Western influences, with more Western influences than Iran. But are there similar thought patterns? That would be the first question. Another person asks if you could talk a bit about the situation of women before the Taliban came. You did that already, but if you want to add something, you're very welcome to do so. Another question says, a number of studies show that the inclusion of women in peace negotiations is crucial for the stability of peace and security. What role and influence do Afghan women have in the peace talks with the Taliban? And the very last question on that matter, and then I'll leave the floor to you. Someone asks, are there any limitations for women to be politically active according to Islam? A lot of questions, and the floor is yours. Yeah, let us turn on your
Mute now. Okay.
Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I hope I will not miss any questions. So if I do, please help me repeating them. Maybe starting from the first question, the difference between Iran and Afghanistan. There are interesting differences. The post-2001 context of Afghanistan, if we compare this with Iran, I think we have been to Iran. I have been to Iran a couple of times, and having different sort of access to different groups there, particularly women groups in Iran. And when we compare our realities, it was very evident that despite all the challenges that we were talking about, I would say, fortunately, in Afghanistan, there is much less restriction from the state when it comes to women and women's active role. As I mentioned in my remarks, the fact that we are not using the title feminism is also to do with the sensitivities. I mentioned that isms are a little bit complicated when it comes to Afghanistan because of the Soviet invasion to begin with and the following situations that happened after that. So by avoiding only the title, we try to sort of bypass the whole package that comes with the identity of whether feminism is a Western phenomenon or an Eastern phenomenon, and what it really means contextually. So we sort of bypass that conversation, but mainly bring our focus into actively working in the society, whether promoting women's role in the decision making, to promote women as ministers and deputy minister, or to be more active in the grassroots activism. I would have to say here that with the proud that actually in the past year or a couple of years since the discussions and conversations about the peace talks with the Taliban started, women across the country and that includes women in remote areas and women in the cities, in the capital. They became the most active and the most vocal part of the civil society in Afghanistan, reminding the president, reminding the leadership of Afghanistan, reminding the world that they cannot be ignored in the peace with the Taliban. And this really became a game changer, because at the very beginning, even unfortunately, our international supporters, but also our own government supporters, some of them, some government officials, I will not say all and everyone, but some, they all were in this mood that, you know what, let's first have peace with Taliban, and then we come back to the question of women and whether a woman will have time, will have right or not. And thanks to the noise making, I would call it, and it was also called by some people from the sort of the pro-Taliban people, that why women were making too much noise. We never say that we don't give right to women or not. I mean, we never talk about this, so why are you making so much noise? And we say, well, really, if we didn't make that noise, you were completely ignoring us. And that's, to me, that's more important, to be active on the ground and try to find your place within the context to operate and to bring a change. Whether you name it one thing or another thing, that can cause, you know, different issues due to the different factors that are involved there. So yeah, there are differences in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of freedom of organizations and all that. That also is linked with the very last questions asked. What are the limitations? Fortunately, I would say within the current political order and political system in our constitution, there is no limits. Even nowhere in our constitution it is indicated that women cannot become a president, for example. This is a clear difference with Iran, because in Iran, women cannot become a president. So there are no particular limitations. Women's active participation, women's active political participation is encouraged. Whether we are achieving our goals, unfortunately not, because we are a patriarchal society and there are barriers that are nothing to do with Taliban. Within the so-called technocratic, within the so-called democratic forces in Afghanistan, there is still very dominating mindset of patriarchy. And that requires, you know, ages to actually struggle with and ensure a stronger and a meaningful position for women. So we are not giving up, we are not surrendering, and at the same time, we are finding our ways to operate and to be active about our rights, about our identities, and about our role, about present and future of our country. The other question I think I've covered was women before the Taliban. So like I said, before, just when we say before the Taliban, it can mean anything going back to the 7th century and also. But in immediate before Taliban, as I said, there was a civil war going on between different groups trying to fight over power. And in this civil war period, unfortunately, women's situation was really very bad. There were cases of rapes, kidnappings, massive violations of women's rights. There were no official restriction on women's access to jobs and to justice and to services, but there were no services. It was a wartime in the cities in Afghanistan, a war that was mostly in the rural areas pre-92, moved to the cities and to the capital, the major cities in the country post-92. So between 1992 and 2000, between 1992 and 96, the country was in a complete chaos. And the Taliban came, and that's why at the very beginning, some people were kind of tricked by Taliban by not resisting them, because they say, well, let's first bring peace and stability, and then think of, whether women can have access to jobs or not. But then this was 94, they were saying this 95, by 96, they took over the entire country. No sign of any schools for girls, no signs of, women working outside their houses. And not only that, women were punished for working out of their houses by being lashed in public and all kind of things that were not very common part of our culture and our society. So these things really turn a lot of people against them, because a lot of people who initially were supporting them turn against them because they were not truthful to their promises back then. And that's why for women today, it's even more sensitive to just accept anything the Taliban say, because there is one experience in the very recent history of our lifetime that we remember. And that's why there is more pressure on the government, on the international community, to make sure that women are not excluded from any negotiation teams with the Taliban, and that's their whether by their own participation or by the participation of anyone, men and women attending those talks, there has to be women's place in the society, in the public space, has to be a core and fundamental point of discussion with them. I hope I did not miss anything. Did I miss any question? Oh.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. And due to limited time, it's basically impossible to answer all the questions that have reached us in the meantime. I would like to therefore pose another two, and then we'll see how long your answer takes, and maybe have another one. Someone asked, what do you think, Orzala? How will the Taliban, or how might the Taliban change if they're included into the official governmental structures? That's one. And the second questions would be, what are the major objections or concerns of the central government towards the US-Taliban deal?
Thank you. Okay. The first question was how might change? Okay, if the Taliban, under the scenario the Taliban are included in the government, how they will change, if they will change. Well, if I follow by the rhetorics of Taliban, social media drivers of their social media accounts, I see no sign of any change in the Taliban approach. In my opinion, they have actually moved a little bit into this front of mass media and PR activities. And in that, even though some of their top leadership are trying to, show that, oh, this act is not done by us, like when there are like hospital attacks, they try to say, oh, we didn't do it, or their supporters say they didn't do it. But then the average Taliban who are identify themselves as a Taliban are not really in the mood of changing. So that means that if this is a very hierarchical movement, that they follow their supreme leader, and if the supreme leader orders them that, okay, from now on, we want you to, keep your guns and just don't go and use violence. I am not saying it will be completely impossible, but I am saying I'm saying that it's not also very easy in an overnight activity, that suddenly we will see a ceremony of handshaking between a few people, and then imagine that everyone is becoming so non-violent peacemaker. It's a very complex process. Peace building in general is a very complex process. It has a lot of dimensions. And in the case of Afghanistan, because of the fact that it's it's taken much longer, it's a generational issue. Use of violence is a generational issue for over the last 40 years. The heroes are people who kill more people. So if that's the case, then it requires a lot of work. And unfortunately, as a researcher here, I'm leading a research think tank, and I have to bring that into the conversation, that as a researcher here, what I see missing completely from the situation is the fact that sorry, I have a little niece here trying to come from a is the fact that unfortunately a lot of people are not seeing the reconciliation and the justice issues being addressed in the country. The reconciliation, the justice should be a core part of this conversation, because that's how we can sort of assure that people who have used until yesterday or even today violence will tomorrow be peaceful people. It's a very complex process, and so far I have not seen any signs, not only, by the way, from the government, from the Taliban side, I should also say from the government side. It's extremely disturbing that a legitimate government is also just acting like a Taliban. and posting photos of Taliban being, you know, bodies on the streets and saying, here is our revenge. This is not helping the peace process, I'm afraid. So it requires a lot of work on that front. What are the major objectives of the Afghan government? Afghan government has objections, but it doesn't have much choices. Afghan government has been forced, in my opinion, to accept that they have to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners from the Afghan prisons. Some of these prisoners are prisoners that were not simply and peacefully arrested with very like respectful way. They are arrested during an operation that lasted in massive casualties. The famous one was the German embassy bombing, as it is known, Zambak Square. I was in Kabul in my office, only less than a kilometer away from that incident. It was one of the most, in my life, it was the strongest attack that I was experiencing. A lot of people lost their lives, a lot of people were injured, still going through a lot of traumas due to that incident. Somebody who was planning that attack, I heard, is also on the list to be released. So here comes the question of justice. And what are we going to do? Is this a real justice and reconciliation if you just, you know, release them out of prison regardless of what they have done? And is there a guarantee? I think one of the, probably this is an Afghan helplessness actually by the Afghan government, that they don't have any means to guarantee that the 5,000 people that they are forced by the Americans to release will not resort back to violence. Because look, since the last week or so, we see an unprecedented escalation in the violence, first started by Taliban and then continued by the Afghan government in a level that is quite worrying. So more or less, that's where we are at the moment, unfortunately.
Dear Orzala, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to listening to all of your assessments on the political developments in Afghanistan. And there are, to be honest, there's another dozen of questions. If you're okay with this, I don't feel obliged to do so, but I can forward them to you after the event. And if you find time, you can also just answer them by sending a voice message to me, for example. This would be amazing. So all the people who still have questions can somehow gain even more from this event. So thank you so much for taking your time, and all the best to you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Yes, please send me the questions. I will see if I can answer them. And people can also follow my Twitter account, on which I'm not very active on it, but I sometimes try to, reflect my thinkings on daily or weekly basis. So that can also be, it's at Orzala on Twitter for people who want to follow.
Perfect. So I asked the people behind the scenes to mention your Twitter account in the chats of Zoom and Facebook. And so thank you very much. Goodbye. All the best to California.
Thanks a lot. Bye.